At 68, you learn that betrayal rarely arrives shouting. It usually arrives quietly, in ordinary rooms, spoken in ordinary voices. Mine arrived in a hospital recovery ward in Vancouver General Hospital, late on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in October, just after 2:17 p.m. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, sharp and medicinal. A heart monitor pulsed beside my bed with a slow electronic rhythm, steady, patient, indifferent. I had just come out of coronary bypass surgery, the kind where surgeons temporarily stop your heart and trust machines to keep the rest of you alive. It gives a man time to think. The nurse adjusting my foreline, Michelle Carrington, spoke gently. "Pain level right now, Mr. Whitaker." "Manageable," I told her. My voice sounded thin even to me. Outside the room window, the sky over False Creek had that grey, wool blanket look Vancouver gets in late autumn. Rain traced slow paths down the glass. Michelle checked the monitor and nodded. "Your wife said she'd be back shortly." That sentence hung in the room for a moment. Because 10 minutes earlier, before Michelle had stepped out, my wife had leaned close to the bed rail. I could still smell her perfume, something citrus and expensive, cutting through the sterile hospital air. Her voice was low, almost casual. "Let's be honest, Richard," she had said, folding her arms. "At this point, you're basically my pension check with a heartbeat." I remember staring at the ceiling tiles after she said it. Each one identical. Perfectly square. Calm, orderly things. My chest ached, but not from the surgery. From clarity. After 42 years of marriage, a person should know when something inside the relationship has quietly died. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just expired. Michelle returned with a small plastic cup of water. "You look pale," she said gently. "I just heard something," I replied. "What kind of something?" "The kind that makes a man start reviewing his paperwork." She smiled politely, assuming I meant medical forms. But here's what I didn't know then. My wife believed she already understood my finances completely. She thought every dollar I owned arrived once a month, electronically, from the federal pension system. She believed my life, and eventually my death, had already been calculated. What she didn't know was that some assets are never listed in the obvious places. Some decisions are prepared years in advance. And some men, especially older men, keep their most important documents somewhere very quiet. Like a safety deposit box containing exactly $482,600 in bearer bonds and legal instructions. But at 2:17 p.m. that Tuesday, lying under fluorescent lights while rain tapped softly against hospital glass, I didn't know the full truth yet either. I only knew one thing. Something about my life, my marriage, had just shifted permanently. And what I would discover next would explain everything. My name is Richard Allen Whitaker, and at the time this story began, I was 68 years old, living in a quiet brick townhouse in Kitsilano, Vancouver, 3 blocks from the water and a 15-minute walk from Jericho Beach. For most of my adult life, I worked as a forensic financial examiner with PricewaterhouseCoopers Canada, later contracting with the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. I did that work for 37 years. My job was simple to describe but difficult to perform. I followed money that people hoped no one would ever trace. In forensic accounting, numbers rarely lie. People do. But numbers leave footprints, timestamps, routing paths, microtransactions that accumulate into patterns. You learn patience in that profession. And patience, I discovered later, applies to marriage as well. Most mornings in retirement followed the same quiet rhythm. I woke around 6:10 a.m., long before the neighborhood stirred. Vancouver mornings often carried that damp coastal chill, the kind that crept through window frames and made the hardwood floor cool under bare feet. I would grind coffee beans, Ethiopian yirgacheffe, medium roast, and the smell filled the kitchen like warm earth after rain. My granddaughter, Emily Whitaker, who was 9 then, occasionally stayed with us on weekends. When she did, she shuffled into the kitchen in oversized socks and sat at the island counter. "Grandpa, why do you wake up before the sun?" she once asked, rubbing her eyes. "Because numbers are easier to understand before the world gets noisy," I told her. She considered that seriously. "That sounds like detective work." "In a way," I said. Emily laughed. "You're a money detective." That was close enough. My wife, Karen Whitaker, preferred a different schedule. She woke closer to 9 a.m., usually after the house had already warmed from the morning sunlight hitting the west-facing windows. Karen had once been generous and energetic in ways I admired deeply. When our children were young, She organized school fundraisers and volunteered at St. Augustine Elementary in Kitsilano. People liked her easily. And I liked that people liked her. But careers that revolve around financial investigations teach you something subtle. Patterns matter. Small changes in behavior, barely noticeable at first, often signal larger movements underneath. I had learned to recognize those patterns in corporations and pension funds. What I didn't fully realize then was that the same analytical instincts were quietly cataloging patterns in my own life. Not consciously, just professionally. Because long before the hospital room, long before the sentence Karen spoke beside my bed, certain financial decisions had already been made. Decisions involving a safety deposit box at the RBC branch on West Broadway, registered solely under my name, and contents valued precisely at $482,600. But those preparations hadn't come from suspicion. They had come from something much simpler. Experience. And experience, I've learned, is the most patient teacher a person ever meets. Retirement was supposed to be the gentle chapter. After 37 years in forensic accounting, I imagined something quieter. Walks along Jericho Beach, occasional lunches with former colleagues, perhaps teaching Emily the patient art of balancing a ledger the way my father once taught me. For a while, it looked like that might happen. Karen had always enjoyed travel and social gatherings, and during the first years after I left PricewaterhouseCoopers Canada, I tried to make those things possible. The first sacrifice came in March 2018, when Karen mentioned she wanted to visit Tuscany with her sister, Elaine Morris. "It's something we always talked about," she said over breakfast one Saturday. The smell of toasted rye bread filled the kitchen while rain tapped lightly against the windows. Just a couple of weeks. Nothing extravagant. The trip cost $12,740.60 once flights, accommodations, and excursions were finalized. I transferred the money the following Monday. "You didn't have to do that so quickly," Karen said, surprised. "I know," I replied. "But some things should happen while people still want them." She kissed my cheek that morning. It felt sincere. The second sacrifice came 2 years later. Our son, Daniel Whitaker, had been struggling to keep his small landscaping company afloat in Burnaby. Equipment loans were piling up, and the business account had dipped dangerously low. Karen approached me late one evening in September 2020, while the television hummed quietly in the background. "Daniel just needs a bridge," she said carefully. "A little time." The amount required was $26,380.45. I wired it the next morning. Daniel called afterward, his voice thick with relief. "Dad, I swear I'll pay this back." "Take care of the business first," I told him. Promises like that often begin with good intentions. The third sacrifice was larger. In April 2022, Karen became interested in purchasing a fractional ownership share in a wine cooperative in Kelowna, something called Okanagan Crest Estates. It wasn't technically an investment, more like a lifestyle club for people who enjoyed vineyard retreats. Her portion required $47,920.80. I remember pausing briefly while reviewing the paperwork at the dining room table. The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, casting narrow bars of light across the documents. "Are you sure this is necessary?" I asked gently. Karen shrugged. "Everyone in the group is doing it." That sentence gave me a small moment of doubt. In forensic accounting, the phrase "everyone is doing it" often appears right before an audit begins. But Karen looked excited. Hopeful, even. So I signed. Not long after that, Daniel's wife, Melissa Carter Whitaker, began attending some of the gatherings Karen hosted at the house. Melissa had a way of shaking hands that barely touched your palm, quick, distracted. Her eyes tended to drift past you toward whoever entered the room next. Yet she was undeniably capable. She ran Daniel's company books efficiently and once spent an entire afternoon helping Emily assemble a complicated science fair display about coastal ecosystems. That was her redeeming quality. Melissa could be attentive when it mattered to her. But here's what I didn't know then. Generosity creates patterns too. And sometimes, the people closest to you begin to believe those patterns will never change. Heart trouble rarely announces itself dramatically. In my case, it arrived on a cold Monday morning in late October, while I was walking along the seawall near Jericho Beach, just after 7:40 a.m. The air had that wet Pacific chill, sharp enough to sting the lungs slightly. Gulls circled above the grey water, their cries echoing against the quiet shoreline. I remember tightening my coat collar and thinking the wind felt unusually cold. Then the pressure started. It wasn't a stabbing pain. More like someone slowly tightening a heavy band across my chest. My breath shortened. The path ahead blurred slightly. A passing jogger, Thomas Gallagher, noticed me sitting down on a driftwood log. "You all right, sir?" he asked. "I believe. I may need an ambulance," I said carefully. Within 20 minutes, I was in the emergency department at Vancouver General Hospital, fluorescent lights glaring overhead while nurses moved with quiet efficiency. The diagnosis came quickly: 3 critical coronary blockages. Surgery was scheduled for the following afternoon, Tuesday at 1:05 p.m. Karen visited briefly that evening. She stood near the hospital bed scrolling through her phone while the ventilator hummed softly behind me. "This is serious," I told her quietly. She nodded without looking up. "Doctors handle this every day." "Will you be here tomorrow?" I asked. "Of course." The surgery lasted 4 hours and 18 minutes. When I woke in recovery, my throat felt raw from the breathing tube. Machines beeped softly in the background. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and warmed plastic tubing. Karen arrived around 2 p.m., carrying a takeaway coffee from Tim Hortons. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she leaned against the window and stirred the cup absent-mindedly. "You gave everyone quite a scare," she said. "I suppose I did." There was a pause. Then she walked closer to the bed rail and lowered her voice. "Let's be practical for a second, Richard." I turned my head slowly. "At this point," she said, "you're basically my pension check with a heartbeat." The words landed softly, calmly, as if she were commenting on the weather. My hands tightened slightly against the hospital sheet. I could hear ice clinking in her plastic coffee lid. "I see," I said. Karen sighed, almost impatiently. "I'm just being realistic." At that moment, Nurse Michelle Carrington stepped back into the room, adjusting the medication pump beside the bed. "Everything all right here?" she asked. Karen straightened. "Fine." But 10 minutes later, when Michelle returned with water, Karen had already left the room. Her chair remained empty beside the bed. Later that evening, around 7:30 p.m., I noticed something else. Daniel had posted a photograph on Instagram. Karen and Melissa were sitting at the Sandbar Seafood Restaurant in Granville Island, glasses raised, smiling under warm amber lighting. The caption read, "Celebrating a new investment opportunity tonight." My phone screen dimmed slowly in my hand. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm beside me. And as the rain began tapping softly against the hospital window, one quiet thought settled in my mind. I didn't know yet what I was about to find. Recovery from bypass surgery forces a certain stillness on a man. For several weeks after I returned home to Kitsilano, my instructions from Dr. Alistair Ng, the cardiac surgeon at Vancouver General Hospital, were very clear. Short walks. No heavy lifting. And absolutely no stress. I nodded politely when he said it. But forensic accountants do not retire from observation simply because their employer stops paying them. They just change what they observe. The first unusual detail appeared on Thursday, November 17th, at 9:42 a.m., while I was reviewing our joint credit card statement online. The house was quiet except for the low hiss of the espresso machine warming in the kitchen. One charge caught my eye. $3,860.75, Okanagan Crest Estates, Kelowna. I leaned closer to the screen. Karen already owned her fractional membership in that cooperative. The payment schedule had been completed 6 months earlier. This charge was new. "Karen," I called toward the living room. She appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a pale blue sweater. "Yes." "Did you authorize another payment to the Kelowna Wine Group?" She frowned briefly. "Oh, that. It's a small expansion fee. Everyone contributed." "How much exactly?" "Under $4,000. Technically true. Still, the charge lingered in my thoughts. In forensic work, unexplained secondary payments often signal the start of a pattern. But it was explainable. So I let it pass. For the moment. The second discovery arrived 2 weeks later, on Tuesday, November 29th, while I was reviewing property tax notices that had arrived by mail. The envelope carried the return address of McLean and Horowitz Real Estate Law, Vancouver. Inside was a confirmation document referencing a down payment transfer of $64,380.20. The property address listed: Unit 508, 1188, Howe Street, downtown Vancouver. I read the document twice. We didn't own a property there. I walked slowly into the kitchen where Karen was slicing oranges for breakfast. Karen, I said calmly, placing the paper on the counter. Can you explain this transaction? She glanced at it and shrugged. Oh, that. Melissa and Daniel are considering a rental investment. I helped them with the deposit. With $64,000. They'll refinance it later, she said. It's temporary. From our joint savings. She hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Well, yes. A reasonable explanation. But the timing disturbed me. The transfer had been executed 3 days after my heart surgery, while I was still in the cardiac intensive care unit. I nodded slowly. Next time, I said, we should discuss amounts like that first. Of course, Karen replied quickly. Her tone was smooth. Too smooth. But here's what I didn't know then. The third discovery would remove any remaining doubt. It arrived on Friday, December 16th, at precisely 1:14 p.m., during a routine meeting with my former colleague Raj Mehta, who had become a senior compliance officer at RBC Royal Bank's West Broadway branch. We were sitting in his glass-walled office overlooking the wet pavement outside. Rain streaked the windows while traffic hissed along Broadway. Raj slid a printed ledger across the desk. I assumed this was authorized, he said carefully, but something about the structure looked unusual. I examined the entries. 3 wire transfers. $118,400, October 25th. $96,720.50, November 3rd. $84,960.40, November 21st. Each routed through a holding account connected to Daniel's landscaping company, Evergreen Horizon Landscaping Limited. My stomach tightened. That account requires 2 authorizations, I said quietly. Raj nodded. Yes. Yours, and Karen's. I ran the numbers quickly in my head. Total transfers, $300,080.90. Executed during my surgical recovery. Raj folded his hands. I didn't want to assume wrongdoing, he said carefully. But the memo field on the transfers concerned me. What does it say? He turned the page. Each entry contained the same note. Advance on inheritance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped steadily against the office window. Then Raj asked quietly, Richard, were you aware of these transfers? I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling lights. For 37 years, I had followed financial trails for corporations and regulators. Patterns always tell the truth eventually. And now the full pattern was clear. Karen and Daniel believed my death was simply a matter of timing. And they had already begun distributing the assets. But by that afternoon in Raj's office, one important fact had changed. I now had every document. Every transfer record. Every timestamp. The entire timeline of the betrayal sat neatly organized in front of me. All that remained was deciding what to do with it. In my profession, direct confrontation was rarely the first step. Evidence came first. Documentation second. Institutional protection third. Emotion, if it appeared at all, arrived last. So on Monday, January 9th, at 10:30 a.m., I sat across a polished oak conference table inside Palmer & Associates, Corporate and Estate Law, on Georgia Street in downtown Vancouver. The office smelled faintly of leather chairs and fresh printer toner. My attorney, Margaret Palmer, had practiced estate litigation in British Columbia for nearly 30 years. She read the bank statement slowly, glasses resting low on her nose. $300,000 moved under false authorization, she said quietly. During your cardiac recovery. I nodded. And the note field says, advance on inheritance. That's correct. Margaret tapped the page with a pen. This is textbook financial exploitation. I didn't answer immediately. The window behind her looked out over grey January clouds hanging low over Burrard Inlet. What would you like to do? She asked. Secure the remaining assets first. Margaret smiled slightly. Practical. I like that. Within 2 hours, several things happened in precise sequence. The joint savings account was frozen under fraud review. $182,420.15 remaining in that account was transferred to a protected estate holding trust. A legal notice was prepared revoking Karen's financial authorization privileges. A formal demand letter was drafted regarding the $300,080.90 already withdrawn. By 4:12 p.m., the paperwork was complete. That evening, I placed a phone call. Karen answered on the third ring. Hello. Karen, I said calmly. We need to talk. There was a pause. What about? Money. Her voice sharpened slightly. What money? The 3-wire transfers to Daniel's company. The condo deposit. The cooperative charge in Kelowna. Silence filled the line for 3 full seconds. Then came the first stage. Denial. I don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly. I read the numbers slowly from the ledger. When I finished, her tone changed. Stage 2. Justification. Richard, Daniel needed help, she said. You always said family comes first. $300,000. It's an advance. It would have been his eventually anyway. Eventually. I could hear kitchen drawers opening in the background, the metallic clink of cutlery. Then the final stage. Bargaining. Look, Karen said, her voice softening. Maybe we should have talked first. But you were in surgery. We didn't know if you'd recover. I let that sentence rest between us. Finally she asked, almost cautiously, so what happens now? I spoke slowly. Karen, the accounts are frozen. A legal demand has been issued. And the remaining assets are no longer accessible to you. Her breath caught slightly. You can't do that. I already did. Another pause. You're overreacting, she said quietly. That was when I delivered the only sentence I had prepared. For 42 years I trusted you with my life, I said. But I never gave you permission to calculate my death. The line went silent. Neither of us spoke again. I ended the call first. The meeting took place on Thursday, February 2nd, at 11 a.m., inside a private boardroom at RBC Royal Bank, West Broadway branch. The sky outside Vancouver had that pale winter brightness that arrives after a night of rain, the streets still dark and wet. Present in the room were Karen Whitaker, our son Daniel Whitaker, my attorney Margaret Palmer, and Raj Mehta, the senior compliance officer who had first alerted me to the transfers. Daniel looked uneasy the moment he walked in. He kept adjusting the sleeve of his jacket, glancing between me and Margaret. Karen was more composed. Richard, she said as she sat down, this seems excessive. Margaret slid a thin folder across the table. The paper made a soft scraping sound against the polished wood. Mrs. Whitaker, she said calmly, before we begin, I want to clarify the numbers. She opened the folder. The total unauthorized transfers currently under review amount to $300,080.90. Daniel shifted in his chair. Karen folded her arms. That money was family support, she said evenly. Richard always intended to help Daniel. Raj spoke for the first time. Intent is not the issue, he said gently. Authorization is. The room grew quiet except for the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Margaret turned another page. Now, she continued, there is also the matter of the estate reserve. Karen frowned slightly. What reserve? That was the moment everything shifted. Raj placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was the official inventory record for Safety Deposit Box 417, registered solely to Richard Allen Whitaker. Margaret read the document aloud. Contents include $482,600 in federally issued bearer bonds, 2 sealed estate directives, and notarized beneficiary designations. Karen's face lost color. Daniel blinked. You never told us about that, he said quietly. No, I replied. Because the box had been established 14 years earlier, long before retirement, during a complex pension audit case that taught me an uncomfortable lesson about financial independence. Karen looked at me carefully. So this whole time, she said, you had almost $500,000 hidden. Protected, I corrected gently. Margaret closed the folder. The estate directives inside that box were updated 3 days ago, she said. Daniel's voice tightened. Updated how? I answered that one myself. The funds will now be placed in an education trust for Emily Whitaker. They will be released to her in stages beginning at age 21. Silence followed. A long, heavy silence. Karen stared at the table. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. No shouting happened. No dramatic gestures. Just understanding. After a moment, Raj spoke softly. The legal recovery process for the $300,080.90 will proceed separately. Karen looked up at me once more. You really planned all this? I stood from the table. No, I said quietly. I just prepared for the possibility that someday I might need to. As I walked toward the door, Daniel spoke again. Dad, Emily will appreciate that. I paused briefly. She already does, I said. Because the week before, while helping her with homework at my kitchen table, Emily had looked up and said something simple. Grandpa, you're the only grown-up who explains things honestly. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrives with clarity. And a locked box finally opened at the right moment. Legal matters rarely resolve overnight, but clarity accelerates many processes. By late May, 4 months after the meeting at RBC's West Broadway branch, the situation had settled into something resembling order. The forensic documentation we presented through Palmer and Associates left very little room for argument. The unauthorized transfers totaling $380.90 were formally classified as financial misappropriation within a joint account structure, which in British Columbia carries specific civil recovery provisions. Daniel agreed to a structured repayment settlement. Under the agreement filed with the Supreme Court of British Columbia, his company, Evergreen Horizon Landscaping Limited, would repay $182,400 over 8 years through quarterly installments tied to corporate revenue. The remaining $117,680.90 was absorbed through liquidation of the House Street condo deposit, which had never fully closed escrow. Karen moved out of the townhouse in Kitsilano shortly afterward. There was no shouting the day she packed. Just the soft sound of cardboard boxes sliding across hardwood floors and the faint smell of dust rising from closets that hadn't been opened in years. At one point she paused in the kitchen doorway. "I didn't expect things to end like this," she said quietly. "Neither had I. But expectations and outcomes often live in different neighborhoods. I hope you land somewhere stable," I told her. She nodded once, then left. The house felt unusually quiet that evening. Rain tapped lightly against the windows again, Vancouver's familiar soundtrack. But the silence wasn't heavy. It was simply space. The $482,600 in bearer bonds remained secured temporarily under RBC Estate Management, awaiting their scheduled transfer into the Emily Whitaker Educational Trust, which would activate on July 1st. Emily herself visited most Saturdays. She would arrive around 10 a.m., her backpack thumping softly against the kitchen chair as she dropped it. "Grandpa, can we work on the math puzzle again?" she asked one morning while the smell of pancakes drifted from the stove. "Of course," I said. We sat at the same oak table where so many financial documents had been reviewed months earlier. Now the surface held only a notebook, pencils, and a glass of orange juice. "Why do numbers always have an answer?" she asked. "Because numbers require balance," I told her. She nodded thoughtfully. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Daniel called. "Dad," he said carefully, "I'm fixing things at the company. It'll take time, but I'm doing it properly this time." His voice sounded older somehow. "I'm glad to hear that," I said. That conversation lasted only 3 minutes. But it was honest. And honesty, I've learned, is a stronger foundation than apology. These days my mornings in Kitsilano have returned to their quiet rhythm. Coffee at 6:10 a.m. A walk along Jericho Beach if the weather cooperates. The Pacific air still carries that cool, salted scent rolling in from the water. Life didn't become perfect after everything that happened. But it did become clear. And clarity, at 68, is worth more than most people realize. If you've lived long enough to be watching this story, then you already know something important about time. It doesn't move faster as we age. It simply becomes more honest. At 68, I no longer measure life the way I did when I was 40. Back then I measured success in promotions, income statements, retirement forecasts. Numbers on paper. Clean and precise. But numbers only tell part of the truth. What they can't measure is loyalty. Or intent. Or the quiet moment when someone decides that your value is smaller than the role you once played in their plans. If you've ever felt that shift, maybe in your own family, you know exactly what I mean. A dismissive sentence. A decision made about your life without asking you. A moment when you realize someone has already begun calculating what comes after you. It happens more often than people admit. But here is something I learned during those 37 years working forensic finance investigations. Every system, every company, every account, every ledger, eventually reveals its truth. Patterns always surface. And people reveal their patterns too. Some people treat your generosity as trust. Others treat it as access. The mistake many older people make is believing those two things are the same. They are not. You are allowed to protect the life you built. You are allowed to move money, write new documents, establish new boundaries, and change the direction of your estate if trust has been broken. That isn't cruelty. That's stewardship. Because everything you earned, every early morning, every late night, every quiet sacrifice, belongs to the life you actually lived. Not the one someone else imagined inheriting. These days when I sit at the kitchen table in Kitsilano with my morning coffee, Emily sometimes asks about my old work. "Grandpa," she said recently, pencil tapping her math notebook, "how did you always find a mistake in complicated numbers?" I told her the same thing I used to tell junior auditors when they first joined our investigation teams. "You don't start by assuming anyone is guilty," I said. "You start by asking whether the numbers still balance." That principle works for money. And it works for relationships too. If the trust no longer balances, if respect disappears, if honesty disappears, then the account between two people has already closed. The only question left is whether you recognize it. So if you're watching this and quietly wondering whether you're allowed to protect yourself, the answer is yes. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to draw a line. And you're allowed to move forward with dignity intact. Because the people who truly love you will respect the boundaries you place around your life. The ones who don't, they were never yours to begin with.